Well, it is so good to see you and connect with you. And I'm sorry that it's during such a moment of crisis for Minneapolis and for the world. And I guess my first question is just, how are you doing right now digesting this news? How are you feeling?
You know, I mean, I'm obviously personally, I'm doing well. I'm doing good. But I think, just spiritually, you know, um, my heart is broken. We are at a place, in America right now that's just a sad place to be in. Where my kid is doing a project for school about Frederick Douglass, right? And all the different, um, how far we've come as a culture, as a society, as Black people, and and when he's finishing that project, this happens, you know, and he's wondering, how does he finish this? Does he finish it by saying basically nothing's changed? Because it's basically in essence the same thing going on right now. So but no, my perspective is probably the same as so many other people, because I've heard people say it. And obviously I was born and raised in Minneapolis, and and having felt the pressure of the police station, because every Black man in America, in Minneapolis, but across the country, really is one cop stop away from possible death, me included. Didn't matter who. I mean, I know people that I'm close to that got stopped. The reason that I wrote Black Man in America was because a friend of mine had told me about an incident where he was just standing on a bus stop, and the police came and basically started harassing him. Before he knew it, he got beat, taken to jail, tased, maced, and everything else, just because he's like, why can't I stand here? I'm just waiting for the bus. And that's it. He said the wrong thing. So, I mean, that's where we live, and I think, it's unfortunate that it took, that the murder, I mean, in broad daylight, the blatant murder of a Black man to get, I guess, other folks, white folks, basically, to see that what Black people have been saying, for decades now, for years now, was actually a reality, and, I mean, it's just sad. It breaks my heart, because, he was on that guy's neck. I mean, it takes me 10 minutes to drive my kids to school, right? He was on that guy's neck for that whole ride. And that's how my kids understand. That's how I understand it. 10 minutes to get in the car, start it, drive, get on the freeway, drive all the way to their school. It takes 10 minutes.
Yeah.
That's a long time. It's murder. And so, all the violence, could have been avoided if they would have just done what they should have done and placed that man under arrest, place all of those police officers under arrest, and show that basically nobody is above the law. There cannot be, two sets of rules, in society, one for police, or one for white folks, one for Black folks. And, that's got to end, I mean, because, it's just sad. I mean, we'd love to see, that post-racial society that, some of the New York writers wrote about, and, when Barack Obama was president, somehow or another, people thought that somehow that we had reached a place where, we were all equal. We were all in this thing together. We could be, really free and understood, and all the nuance and everything in between. But we're not there. It's like, it keeps getting proven that that's not where we are. But I honestly think, and the glimmers of hope that I always see, is that white folks step up. Because it's one thing for Black folks to do what Black folks have always done. I mean, throughout history, we have no law enforcement. We have no law enforcement entity. Protect and serve is to protect and serve some, but to protect them against people like me, and that's sad. And so, but to see white folks stepping up and speaking out, on everything, but in this case, realizing that, this has been an injustice. People have been saying that, but now they see it, and to speak up, and to not just speaking up about, this incident. Yeah, absolutely. But consistently speaking up about inequality, speaking up about education, speaking up about fairness, criminal justice system. All of these things need to be, something that all of us need to be talking about and speaking about. And because, if I grew up, I grew up in a neighborhood, in an environment where it was in the projects, but the reality was there were white people, there were Native Americans, there were Hispanic, everybody was there. So I really didn't, for the first 10 years of my life, didn't quite understand, I guess, the racism. And my parents did a really good job trying to keep us from that reality. But then it happened quite starkly for me because a neighbor, took it upon himself to call me a nigger and kick me. And, then my brother heard him and went out and, basically beat his ass, but then he had to, it turned into a whole thing, but, and that was my introduction to reality, unfortunately. And then it went from there, because when we moved into, on 1244 Russell, it was, the riots were happening. It was just a whole nother, that was riots then, 68, and so it just, you want to think that we at some point we're going to cross a bridge and, you get that fairness and you can go back and you can unlock your doors and you can feel safe. You can have, expensive cars and because there's equality and fairness, you don't have to worry about people who feel like they're going to take from you because they have so little, it's just, we have to get to that. We're going to get to that point. I look at, my grandchildren and my children and I think, I know that their spirit is there, and they're reaching for that. They're striving for that, and, so I think that the future is going to be set and eventually we're going to get there. It'd be nice to get there now, people like me, we, whatever platform we have, we have to speak out and we have to stand up and we have to do our part, as much and as fervently as we can. I've written songs. I wrote songs about Trayvon. I wrote songs about voting. I've written songs about, Hot Night in the Neighborhood, when Mike Brown was killed, Black Man in America, Black Lives Matter. I've personally written a lot of songs, American Dream, and I'm going to keep writing songs, because I think, that's that's the main reason why I really kind of came back and got back into, the music business, because there is no music business, but I just thought that my voice and, skill set was such that, writing songs, about, what I have lived and what I see my family and people that I know living on a regular basis, people need to hear that, but unfortunately we have gatekeepers, who don't allow messages. They filter all of that stuff. And that's why I really appreciate you, allowing me to come on and to be able to have a voice and to be able to, speak on these things.
Yeah. I hope in my heart that we're at some kind of turning point. The historian in me feels not as hopeful because of the cyclical nature of everything. I was sitting here the other night, the first night, Tuesday night, I guess, when things really started heating up as people were expressing their anger about what happened. And I could hear things in the distance. It wasn't on my immediate street, but I could hear explosions, sirens, helicopters. And honestly, Andre, one of my first thoughts was, is this what it was like for Prince and Andre living in North Minneapolis? And what would that do to a kid that's only 8, 9, 10 years old? I don't know if you can even answer that question, but I mean, this has been going on almost your whole entire life here in Minneapolis. And how did that shape your worldview? How has that lingered for you throughout your life?
I can definitely speak on it because, the thing is, a lot of people don't understand, the lifestyle that I lived and Prince lived living with us, because, they just know the fame and, all that kind of stuff. And that's beautiful. I mean, because to be able to come from where we came from and to be able to succeed on whatever level and, win Grammy Awards and, and do the different things and have hit records. I mean, these are the things that we said, when we were kids, we said one day we're going to do this. One day we're going to win awards. One day we're going to be there and we're going to do all that. it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to do it. But to get to that point, we had to navigate through some crazy waters. I've been shot at, I've been stabbed, I've witnessed somebody murdered, literally shot right next to me. All of these things. Prince, on the other hand, it's like, coming and living with us. He gets brought into an environment where, my brothers were always under siege by the police. They were always after my brothers. So he got to see that play itself out. And, I know it had an effect on him, because, my brother literally gave me a gun, and, said, here, you need to keep this because, you never know what's going to happen. So I had a, silver plated 45, and I was telling Prince about, look, we gotta lock up, we gotta watch out. There's no telling who's going to come after us. And Prince said, wow, you got a gun. I said, yeah. I said, check it out. And he was like, he's holding it. He'd never held a gun, right? And what does he do? Is he points it down the alley and pulls the trigger and shoots right down Plymouth Avenue. I'm like, give me that. Like, what are you doing? It's like, but I think all of that stuff, because, when you're met with blunt force and the reality of what that possibly could have done for him, or what it could have done for all of us, all of these things, seeing that, and seeing people, it goes on and on when I think about what we saw, and what happened to us. I mean, we as a band, going to gigs, got stopped by the police, got hassled by the police. I got taken to jail one time riding him on a motorcycle, and the police came, and I said the wrong thing to the police officer. I'm the kind of guy that, that's why, living in Minnesota, living anywhere really, I've been stopped here. It doesn't matter, but I got stopped there. And me and Prince are on. I'm riding him around on my motorcycle. Actually, it's my brother's motorcycle, and the police stop us. I didn't do anything wrong, but the reality is I didn't have a motorcycle license. But they pull us over, and I'm like, listen, I ain't got no license. What do you want? I'm just very matter of fact about stuff like that. So I'm like, whatever. And so they're like, so they're like going through their whole thing. And then, and then I make the smart remark, well, isn't it against the law to obstruct the flow of traffic? He said, why? Yeah. I said, well, your car is kind of obstructing. Nobody can get around you. He's like, that's it. So he handcuffs me, and then takes me to jail, right? And then Prince obviously is stuck, he's got to go get my mom. And then he goes and, at the time he had his first record out. So they had to come and bail me out. My mom comes and, I think the magazine we were in. And so she's coming down there with like a Right On magazine and Prince in it, and is trying to, get the police, like somehow or another, that's some magic, key that's going to unlock the door. And I wouldn't cooperate because I wouldn't, I thought my hands were, this this sort of pure thing that shouldn't have, fingerprints and ink on it. So I wouldn't let them fingerprint me. So I wound up spending more time, than I needed to, but they eventually got me out. And so, yeah, but yeah, it definitely had I could go on and on with, obviously the things, one of the things that my older brother, Eddie, had spent time in prison, and him and Prince were really close. Obviously he and I were really close, but he and Prince were really close. And, he was basically Eddie's mentor, or Prince's mentor. And he told him a lot about the streets and a lot about a lot of different things, in terms of, really life, because he would give us lectures and tell us about, what it was like in jail and why we didn't need to go there, why we needed to, speak on issues, in our music. And he would point us to, different artists, Gil Scott-Herons and, obviously Bob Marley, all of that were talking about stuff, and gave us, basically the tools to understand, how we can reach an audience, through our lyrics And it's interesting, because we had a blessing of riches in terms of my siblings, at that point in time, and their contribution, because they had extensive record collections and music that, really just covered everything from Laura Nyro to Richie Havens, Joan Armatrading. I mean, it just goes on and on, just, in terms of message music that, when you have that many siblings, I'm the youngest of six, so it's like when you have that many siblings, this just goes on. And if you're, when you're consumed with music, as both Prince and myself were, you're going to dig and you're going to dig and you're going to find, gems, and you're going to discover music. You're going to discover, messages, and it's important, to do that and to basically pay it forward in your music. Whether you do it in the beginning of your music or whatever, or the beginning of your career or wherever you're at, I think it's important to do that. I think that's what artists do. And it's unfortunately we are in a position right now where artists, music artists. What is it? What is an artist these days? I don't even. An artist is somebody who stays hungry, and gets very little, in the way of, a platform, because people aren't trying to hear, what's going on in the world. They don't want to hear the truth. They don't want to hear, the struggle. They don't want to see, it's easier to not believe, but coming back to, George Floyd, you can't deny your eyes. You can't deny what you saw. Everybody's seen, this guy being basically murdered. He's on his knee, like this guy was like kneeling down at, Mount Rushmore, Grand Canyon, looking over, watching the birds fly. It's like, what, as he's taking a man's life. It's just, it's chilling and it's eerie, and it really needs to change. I mean, it really needs to change. And everybody, that's out there listening needs to make it change. It's not just about Black people making a change. It's about society, white people coming, and stepping and standing with Blacks in the struggle and fighting to make this stuff change. We need change. We need to get to that place. And it's one nation, with liberty and justice for all. That's what we need to, that's where we need to be. That's what we should have been there. It's, the fact that, that in my lifetime, you had people hung and, and all kinds of crazy stuff in my lifetime. I'm not that old. I'm old, I'm getting it, but I'm not that old. And and it's like, at what point, if not now, when, you hear the chant and it seems, redundant, but no justice, no peace. You can understand. And I was glad to hear that they finally arrested this man. It should have happened, and it should have happened, and could have happened without all the destruction.
And he's been charged too now with murder and manslaughter.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, people get mad at, protesters, but I think it was Martin Luther King said that violence is the voice of the voiceless. And I think, I think beyond that, I think, violence is the voice of the powerless. So you have riots are the voice of the voiceless. Violence is the voice of the powerless. And flames are the result of oppression. It's like all of these things are all connected, and we should be beyond. And we have to get beyond this. It's really up to us. It's incumbent upon us, as human beings, of the same species, to get beyond this.
I've noticed a couple of somewhat promising news stories that really are trying to take a step back and frame this as, this is the result. The unrest in particular is the result of decades and decades of Minnesotans failing to bring this to light, this massive imbalance between the way people are treated here. I wonder, what has your experience been as a Black man that's lived in Minnesota and outside of Minnesota with, trying to have that conversation that there is this deeply racist past, that this is a segregated Twin Cities, and that the experiences are so different for different parts of the population.
Yeah, no, I mean, I mean, obviously experienced. You can't be Black and not experience it on a somewhat regular basis on one level, or another, or multiple levels. It's institutional racism is what it is. It's like, this world is created. It's like a playground for some, and others, if you get invited, then you're lucky enough to participate. That's sad. That's sad. It's heartbreaking when you actually come to realize that that's what we're living in right now. And I think I've just had so many unfortunate experiences in terms of police and violence, but I think there's a lot of reasons for it, because I think, especially in Minnesota, and I am by no means anti-immigrant or anything like that, or anti, people coming in from different states and all of that. But when it's done by corporations for a specific purpose, because I think that's one of the things that they try to create a divide and conquer system where they get, Blacks to fight amongst themselves, to create dissension. They create, early on, and I guess the late 60s, maybe mid 60s, early 70s, they created a system where it encouraged Black families to split up, basically creating a welfare system, that made it easy for Blacks or poor people in general. I mean, it wasn't just Blacks, it was poor whites, poor Blacks, but, like this virus that we're having to deal with, because we are in the middle of a pandemic, it affects, poor people and Blacks, more than it affects the larger majority. And so it's just, what happens is you have a system where they want cheap labor, and they bring people in and they create this sort of welfare workforce, basically, where it's like they don't get benefits. They don't get health and welfare and all these different things, but they get they're cheap labor. So they can be hired by corporations to work sort of under the table, under the radar. And then people who are established, like for instance, in Minnesota, if you are a resident and you've been living in Minnesota, no matter what color what your background is, you have those benefits, but you're not, sort of a desirable hire for some corporations, because then they got to pay, they got to pay Social Security, they got to have health care benefits. It really breaks down to a political reality. And fortunately, we have people who are speaking out on these things, and people who are from other countries like Ilhan Omar and other people who, Keith Ellison, who's a good friend of mine. And you have a lot of people who are speaking out on these issues and doing things. They're trying to do as much as they can about it. But again, it comes back to, it has to be collective. It can't just be always Black people pushing this rock up the hill, And, I will say this, when you look into the crowd, of protesters in any protest, whether it was back in Martin Luther King, in the civil rights era, in the crowd, thousands and thousands of white folks right there, because they know what's right and they know what's wrong. It's not like it's just a monolith. It's like Black people know what they got to fight for. They know what they've been struggling for and what they've been fighting for, whether they come from other countries and they come for the American dream, or they've been here and they were brought here as slaves, whatever, they know what they're trying to fight for. But I think right now, white folks need to try to figure out what they should be fighting for, and where they, can play a part, because they need to play a part. They need to be a part of this struggle. That's the component that's consistently been missing, and it needs to show up, and it needs to show up now, and it needs to be a part of this, because, we can say whatever we want, but until we really are in that position of power, and we can be really hand in hand marching and saying, we want to do this for our future, for our children's future, and for that ideal that, that was written in the Bible, from that ideal that was written in the Constitution, all men are created equal. We're all, the same under the eyes of the Lord. I mean, we have to get there, and it's going to take all of us to make that a reality.
I think one thing I've observed is that, we had this story that we like to tell about ourselves as Minnesotans, that we're this like very progressive place, and we win all these like best biking city or whatever, that is something to be so proud of. And I think that's just, there's something about the culture here. We're just like obsessed with like being proud of ourselves too. And there's this dissonance with, but all of those things are for white people. And every time something like this happens, more white people, I think, have an awakening to like the real reality that people of color are faced with here. And I think that's where my hope comes in, is that if this could be a catalyst for more white people to take responsibility and to try to be part of a solution and to take responsibility for ourselves and the things we do to contribute to the problems. But again, I go back to that, the studying history hasn't shown, that we've been able to break out of this system so far. So I don't know. I don't know. That wasn't a question. I'm just really grappling with this right now.
No, but you make a good point. You make a good point because, I mean, I think a lot of people mistake that, white people should be proud of who they are. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with, who you are today, who you've become. And, but we just have to be, there has to be fairness, because Black people need to be proud. Arabs need to be proud. Muslims need to be proud. Native Americans need to be proud. Everybody wants to be proud, and that's all. That's it, And so, it's a good point. And I think that's the thing. We all want to participate. We all want to feel a part of that biking pride, that skiing pride,
Right.
that ice fishing pride, I mean, I'm a fisherman. When I come to Minnesota, the first thing I want to do is get on the lake, go fishing, and not have the police boat come over and ask me and harass me until I don't want to come anymore, which is what happened. So it's just like, it's just, we all want to be a part of that. And it's just sad when it's like, oh, nope, there they go. We got to get them off. So they, anyway, it's just, it goes on and on. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Andre, this has been great. It's so wonderful to just connect with you and hear your thoughts. And I just so appreciate you taking the time. And it's always so nice to talk to you. I feel like I could just interview you for hours and hours. But yeah.
I really, really do. Because, people need to, they need to hear from people like me. I mean, it'd be great if they could hear from more people, I'd love for Jimmy and Terry to come on. I'd love for, Morris, even though he's not from Minnesota, but still, he's benefiting from, from the Minnesota music reality. So, all of these guys need to speak out, just because I'm not the highest profile, doesn't mean that we shouldn't all be speaking out. We need to hear from the Al McFarlands and all that. Everybody, I mean, everybody needs to speak out in the community, and all voices are necessary and all voices are important.
Yeah, I agree. Well, this was great. Yeah, I don't have any other questions, but if there was anything else that you wanted to add, we really got into it. So
yeah, no, I mean, I'm a, my mother was an activist. She was very, very active in the community, and she always wanted me to be a politician. And I just thought, what, I'd be maybe too radical. Because, I don't have the patience for injustice. I don't have the patience for, inequality. I don't have the patience. I can't have anybody talking to me in any way that's not anything less than respectful. I just don't have any, I don't have a second for it. I'll be the one that'll be in that bad position. So, but I think, I'm learning, when you have kids and you have grandkids, you start to learn that, what, you have to approach things, with a more level-headed and use wisdom, because now I think I like have a little bit of it and a little better judgment. I'm not as hot-headed as I used to be. So, but, I love my city. I love Minnesota. I think, it's a beautiful place, on its best days, it's really a slice of heaven, on its worst days, it shows, unfortunately, what, the history has shown. And like you said, it's wash, rinse, repeat. And, we've got to stop that. So, but, I'm the optimist. I'm always going to stay hopeful and hope that the better angels will always show up, and at some point give everybody a big smooch on the cheek and say, you know what, we're all in this thing together, because we really are. We're dealing with this pandemic, which is insane, and people are out there marching and not having their masks on. And
I know.
again, you go back to the fact that people are out there, and it's, a lot of folks of color out there with no masks on. And it's just like, this is no joke. Catherine will not allow me to go anywhere. She's like, you can't go. I'm like, but I just want to go. Can I just? No. So it's an interesting time that we're in. This is history. We're always living history, but we're living it in a different way right now. And I want to say, everybody, stay safe, be smart, and again, realize we're all in this thing together. We are all in this thing together. I mean, if we've ever come to realize, that we are in this thing together, and it is important who you choose as an elected leader, you got to come to that realization, because that's where we're at now. We're in this nightmare that almost seems surreal. It seems unrealistic, but here we are, and, those of you who know me know what I've been fighting for. I'm not going to get into politics or anything like that, but those who know me know what I've been fighting for, and it's important, and I'm going to keep fighting for it, and I'm going to keep, and we all have to keep fighting for it, because we are better than this. We really are. I mean, you hear that, and it's a cliche, but it's true. We, me, our kids, you got, you got a little one. It's like, and I have to see, I have to see, because that's just, I was there through the process and seeing, and I'm so happy. It makes me blush, because it's a beautiful thing. It really is a beautiful thing. And so congratulations. I can't say it enough.
Thank you.
And thanks again for having me. I really appreciate it.
I think it really is, being a parent, that's what keeps me optimistic. Like, it has to get better, because it has to be better for her generation. Like, this can't keep happening, and maybe she'll be part of the solution too,
Knowing who her parents are, that's a strong
We'll try.
process.
Yeah. Oh, well, this was so wonderful to see you. I really appreciate you doing this. I will let you get back to your day. I have to go check out the headlines, see what else has developed since we've been talking.
Well, you be well, stay safe, and we'll speak soon.
Okay, sounds good. Thinking of you all. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.